Hi, thank you so much to the organisers for inviting me to this conference. I don't actually speak very much anymore, and I'm assuming that most of you probably aren't familiar with my talks as a result. But when they invited me, I couldn't say no. I've heard so many amazing things about this conference, and as we're coming to a close, every single one of those incredible feelings that I got from others ended up being true, and I ended up feeling them too. So I've had such a wonderful time. Worth the flight. It was only 27 hours, but it was still. And also, didn't Sid's talk that he just completed, didn't that just feel like a therapy session for everybody? It certainly did for me, so thank you. All right, so Cyberpunk for front-end devs. Now, when you think of Cyberpunk, you probably think this dystopian, futuristic, future where, it feels like Tron, there's all sorts of chaos going on, and it's very depressing, right, and post-apocalyptic. The Cyberpunk I want to talk about today is more of an optimistic one, so I want you to keep that in mind. And it's more about pragmatism and things that we can do to stop Cyberpunk being seen as a future concept and see it being as a today concept. So I did come from Australia, and I was born and raised in Melbourne, and that's where I live. And if I had my choice, my job would actually be to maintain this amazing, huge Nilex plastics clock that you see when you're stuck in traffic often, when you're near the city. However, that's not a job, and the sign is no longer actually working, so no one's keeping the lights on, which is quite sad. So of course I pivoted to front-end development naturally, of course, and I did that for a very long time. So I started working professionally in front-end development about 20 years ago. And as you can imagine, 20 years ago, things were very different. I think a few speakers have mentioned before, including Sibsik, sorry if I butchered your name. Not all of us had the internet at home at the time, and so I learned to code through this book here. And I managed to actually track it down from the exact same library when they were throwing it out. And so I was able to actually purchase the original book like years later, which is amazing. So that's on my shelf now. This was one of my first websites that I made, so. Pokemon! Yeah. So, Phil gave such a great presentation about the history and things. I had to add my own 90s kind of throwback in there too, because this is what every single website looked like in the 90s, right? But I think that, even though I've worked in front-end for a while and I did eventually pivot into back-end, I think that happened mostly because I discovered machines and very, very simple, almost primitive machines. And front-end didn't really contain a lot of that. Front-end has the web platform and it's amazing. And we have these really pretty incredibly powerful chips from Intel, AMD, Apple Silicon, and ARM. But for some reason, I found myself fascinated with these kinds of machines. And so, again, referring to Phil's talk, Atwood's law definitely came for me. And I was trying my best to implement every hardware driver in JavaScript for a while and maintain that to be open source. But again, it was because I was so curious about these machines, and this topic is going to play a pretty big part in the rest of this talk about Cyberpunk. So I went through a period where, I went through all of my nostalgic feelings and tried to re-implement them on the web platforms, such as the Game Boy camera and printer, which was just so far ahead of its time. So I did the web platform equivalent of that. Sorry for the bright slide. And so, you can use the Get User Media API, take a selfie of yourself, and then you can plug in any kind of corporate, thermal receipt printer and actually print it out with the very same, or similar aesthetics to the original Game Boy printer. And so I feel very strongly about not letting things be obsolete for no reason, especially if there was something really amazing about them. And so I like this idea of digital preservation being, remixing something and letting it live on through that. And then from there, obviously, the natural choice is to start making really weird circuit boards because, that's not enough. And so I really, really enjoy creating really, really simple things. This only has 3 components on it with a battery. It's got a reed switch, an LED light, and a resistor just to make sure the LED light doesn't burn out. And the idea is that that little magnet is a male anglerfish approaching the very formidable female one. And then when I lived in New York City, I got in my feelings again, and I wanted to create like an homage to the train metro card ticket that you use to take the subway, because I really like trains in the subway. And so this was just a really, again, just using an 8-bit microcontroller that runs at 20 megahertz. Can you imagine? It's so fast. And when you hold the button down, it just plays recordings of some of the announcements that you hear on the trains. And so again, like there was something about these machines that was so different from my day job. And I think that they're very empowering, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. And so my latest shenanigans is deciding to buy an ant farm. That's my first ever pet. And I thought, what if we could take the chaos of ant farms and convert that into randomness that we feed it to cryptographic random number generators so that we can, power OpenSSL. And so if you'd like to talk to me about that project, come find me at the after party because I don't have time. I appreciate you indulging me in some of my projects. And I think it's because they follow a similar theme, and they do have a lot to do with cyberpunk without, really being obvious. So if you indulge me a bit further, I want to talk about the external influences that have sort of led me to be giving this talk today. So these two books fundamentally, almost radicalized me. They changed my behavior in a pretty big way. I highly recommend reading them. They're quite dense. They're not always easy to read. But The Age of Surveillance Capitalism is just an absolute masterpiece, and it's changed the way that I've interacted with the internet, online services, tech companies, everything ever since, and it still colors my behavior to this day in a good way, because the book is actually about owning your own behaviors, and I think that's very important. And then The Hardware Hacker by Andrew Huang is also incredible. In the particular story in his journal in this, which stood out to me, was he tried to design an heirloom computer, which is a laptop computer that never becomes obsolete, and it becomes a family heirloom that you pass through generations, which I thought was an amazing concept, given that we're always begging our corporations for an upgrade every 3 years, right, for our computers. And then we go on to popular media, right? So Looper, the movie, I sort of ended up going on this weird tangent and not really caring about the plotline so much, but I really cared about these cars. And so this might ring a little bit too real at the moment, but in the dystopian future in this movie, fuel is actually a scarce resource, and it's not necessarily available to the lower class in this movie. And so the lower class were able to take their cars and actually convert them so that they could recycle the exhaust back into the car and convert that back into another fuel source that they could continue to use to drive their cars. And I think there's a huge amount of empowerment in this, right? There's right to repair. There's a lot of political messages in this, and the solar panels here are also used to power the dashboard electronics, which I thought was really clever. And so this was Rob Mandel's vision, and he brought it to life in a bunch of garages in Hollywood in order to make this come true. And so I was very, very inspired by this, even though it wasn't even part of the main plot of the movie. And I think you can kind of sum this up really well through one of the originals of Cyberpunk. The street finds its own uses for things. And I think that we don't see that enough in everyday life. We see it in movies, but just not enough. Another huge influence on me has been the friends that I've been really lucky to make. This is Andy Rotano. He is the creator of Super Russian Roulette. So you might not have heard of Super Russian Roulette, but it is a Nintendo Entertainment System game. You're probably wondering, this guy was probably 2 years old when that came out, so how is that possible? And what Andy does is he breathes new life into old machines by creating new things for them when there's not even a market for that anymore. And so his Super Russian Roulette game makes use of the gun that you might have used with the Nintendo Entertainment System, Duck Hunt. Yep, nice. It's very, very clever, and he also introduced little hacks into the actual cartridge itself so that he could expand the audio capabilities of the Nintendo system by being able to play actual sound bites of human speech in the game, which I thought was amazing. But I think more importantly, even though his project is amazing, I think the way that he thought about these things really resonated with me. And that, a lot of the machines that we were both playing with at the time when we were hanging out are knowable systems. They're systems where, I think Richard put it well earlier today, where he said, if you take a car apart and you can put it back together again, then you know how it works. And I would extend that further by saying, and it then belongs to you. And so I think that's also why I was gravitating towards these machines, because again, you just don't really encounter that with the technology that you're expected to use these days. And so if you've ever landed a Cessna 172 before, you will be incredibly viscerally aware that, you know, the only thing that is allowing you to use the elevator tab on the elevator flap on the tail of the plane is just one mechanical cable connected to the yoke of your steering column, right? And so there is this feeling of being at one with the plane as you're bringing it into land, and therefore, you know, mechanically landing a plane without all the fancy widgets that a Boeing or an Airbus has these days is much harder, and so there's a greater sense of accomplishment, ownership over what you're doing, but also feeling at one with the machine. So I had a bit of a crash out recently, and I bought a bike, which I call my midlife crisis, and I think what draws me to bikes as well is that this is a knowable system. Right? You know, it has a very simple mechanism in how it works, and that really hasn't changed very much since the bicycle was invented a very, very, very long time ago. It's actually older than you'd think. And so this photo was taken of my bike a few months ago. I'm now a long-distance cyclist, which is a very strange club to be part of. And so I had a bunch of stuff strapped to my bike. And so over 5 days, I cycled 500 kilometers with 5 strangers who I'd never actually met. And so this is my home state. This is us with the person at the back taking the photo for us. And everything we needed was on the bike. And we did, you know, an average of just over 100 kilometers a day. And it was probably one of the most wholesome experiences of my life. But there was something so wonderfully self-contained, self-reliant, and, you know, real about it, where it's hard to describe the sense of freedom that you get from doing something like that. And so we would find ourselves sometimes literally out in the wilderness right as the sun had risen. And if anything went wrong with your bike or your body, you had to sort it out. There were times when we didn't see another soul, you know, for hours or, you know, even the whole day, depending on the route that we were taking. And so if anything went wrong, it was wonderful to feel confident that we could just figure it out. And things happened, you know, seats broke, people fell off their bikes. We had to end up replacing some parts when we had a particularly bad stormy day. And everything worked out fine. And we just kept such high spirits because we all had that trust and that faith in both ourselves, but also with each other, right? And so here's a quick preview of the kinds of things that you would carry on that trip. If you are a woman, you might recognize one little item there, but we'll keep it our little secret, just for emergencies. But you can see here that there are tools that repair the bike and there are tools that repair me, right? You know, if you get a cramp, you drink some pickle juice and so on. And again, just the feeling of freedom that comes about this when the machine is so simple and you know everything about it, and it's amazing that you can just use the power of your legs to actually have an experience like that. And so it's been deeply moving for me, but it's obviously not a surprise given what I've been interested in. Really long time ago, I'm not sure if anyone's been to Camp JS. Probably not, because it's in Australia and it takes 27 hours to get there. So, so Camp JS is literally what it sounds like. You go to a campground that usually primary school kids go to. There's no internet, there is no phone signal. You all get into a room for 2 or 3 days and you come with a project. It's actually quite similar to the Recurse Center, which Anjana talked about earlier. And you just make what you want to do, and make what you want to make. And it's usually JavaScript flavored because the only thing you do have access to is an offline cached you know, version of the entirety of npm.js. Now, granted, it was a bit smaller back then. This was quite a while ago, but you know, they were stringing Ethernet cables from roof to roof for all of the buildings, and that's all you had access to. And to be honest, that was a really big and uncomfortable moment for me because I think I was fairly early in my career, and that's when I realized how much I would have to stop and Google something. And when you can't do that, there is this awful helplessness, but also just the feeling that you can't rely on yourself to do something, right? And even though you're using libraries that other people had created for you, that's really important. You should never ever try to be an island. Just knowing that like every 5 minutes it felt like I had this instinct to go and have to look up something simple, even just in JavaScript, the language itself. And so that really shook me up in a very good way. And since then I've been really diligent about actually honing my craft and really wanting to be really good at what I did. And you know, it's obviously had huge impact on my productivity and things like that. So thanks for indulging me. There are some themes that are emerging, you know, from this, and so we'll go over them. I also apologize because I sort of chop and change with dark and light slides. And the first theme really is like self-sufficiency and reliance, right? I talked about that quite a few times. And then the second theme here that we are seeing is citizen cooperatives. So these might seem to be actually really contradictory, right? It's like, okay, yeah, like I don't need anyone, but also like I need to be with people, you know? And I think that there is that tension within a lot of humans. It's just like a differing kind of balance of them, right? But I do think that they're really important to have together. And I think you can achieve them together. And I think one sort of feeds into the other and complements them. So let's talk about self-sufficiency and reliance. Do you own your physical tools and machines? And do you own your software and services? So that's what we mean by that. And also, do you possess the knowledge and competence to actually repair what you own? And are your systems knowable? Can you control them? We'll talk about cooperation. Do we actually wish for our fellow citizens to be empowered? I hope the answer to that for everyone here is yes. And not just with technology, but also in their everyday lives. And then how do we actively create this outcome for one another? And I think what's really important here too is to consider non-technical people as well. So I believe that self-sufficiency actually enables civic contribution. And I also believe that overly heavy abstractions disempower in the name of convenience. And I think we're quite readily accepting that convenience sometimes to a fault, because often it can be for profit, you know, over humanity. So we talk about, you know, these two things, right? Self-reliance and also, you know, civic cooperation. But like, what does this actually look like? So there are sort of 3 areas that we can explore for this for the rest of the talk. The first is to build open tools for your fellows. And this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, right? You know, we're very aware of the open source ecosystem. We are unique in software that I think we have the most prolific implementation of it. There are obviously other creative communities that use open source that don't look like GitHub, but I think that's what it is for us and other source control and I guess, what's it called? Social coding tools, right? And the thing is that I think there's a lot of public APIs out there that you probably don't already know about that you could be leveraging to help people. And so, you know, some questions you can ask yourself is, does your local government actually maintain APIs you can use? That's going to vary from country to country. Sometimes that answer is depressing, but sometimes you might actually be surprised. But also, can you crowdsource data as citizens if you don't have access to that, you know, to help keep each other informed? And so we return back to the fuel crisis from the Looper movie, and we are actually, we are actually experiencing that right now worldwide, and some countries are affected more than others. So this website, you can probably identify that as Australia. This website was put together not by the government, but by 2 people that gave a shit. And they are actually making use of some government APIs, and they're making use of crowdsourced data as well. So I think it's a fantastic example. And so you can report outages in your area, and if you're interested in knowing where you can actually get fuel, you can go and have a look in your area and make sure that if you drive there, the bowser is not going to be empty. And so this seems quite dystopian and post-apocalyptic, but it is actually something that's happening. And this website has been so incredibly helpful for people because, you know, we have had genuine fears in Australia of fuel rationing just because of our over-reliance on other countries' you know, resources in order for us to, you know, replenish our supplies. But let's look at like a cool and funny example instead, you know, something we might be able to also relate to though, which is ice cream. So I don't know if you've ever gone to McDonald's before and the ice cream machine's broken. So this website is actually called mabroken.com, which I love. And it started out, through America, but it's actually expanded to other countries. I was surprised to see that it's supported in Melbourne, where I live. And essentially, it's telling you whether or not you can go get soft serve at, a specific location, because there's nothing worse than going through the drive-through and they tell you that that it's not working. It's just absolutely horrendous. And so I think that the author of this website puts it best. They basically said, I reverse engineered the McDonald's API, and I'm currently placing an order worth over $18,000 every minute in every McDonald's to figure out which locations have a broken ice cream machine. So just because they don't have a public API doesn't mean all is lost. Not that I encourage anything that violates the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Just covering myself. But another version of this that I absolutely love, it's one of my favorite ever projects where we use tech to push back, is this two-person startup called Kitsch, who created a Raspberry Pi powered device that they then peddled to McDonald's stores, and it helped bypass the maintenance software on the ice cream machines so that when they broke down, they could immediately fix them instead of having to rely on their very slow mandated, maintenance contracts that they had with the external company that makes the ice cream machines. They got in a lot of legal trouble, as you just saw on the previous slide. I'm not sure if it's quite resolved yet, but I absolutely love this. And if you do have a wide subscription, I would really encourage you to read the entire long read. It's just absolutely amazing. It makes you feel hope for the world, even though it's really just ice cream, but maybe that's a civil right too. Okay, so really bright slide, I apologize. An example of something that I have done in the past to kind of explore this as well is I was really upset many years ago that on Instagram it was very aesthetic to not post an image description. I think that's changed now. It's very trendy too, and just like write this long read, And I thought, people who are vision impaired, they're never going to know what this image is because Instagram also can't really put an alt tag on the images, right? And so there's just no way to have alt tags on a lot of, user uploaded content, right? So what I attempted to do at the time was to use machine learning vision APIs, and I created a bookmarklet in the browser that basically just lifts all the images, asks the service, what's in this image, and then it kind of just like dynamically appends the alt tag. And I did ask permission for the accounts I used. This is, again, Andy Rotano, so I used his permission to do that. I wasn't just kind of uploading people's images into random APIs without their permission. But, the other flaw with this, and Craig called this out perfectly in his talk, was that the models just aren't there yet. They're not as good as a human, and when they mess up in really harmful ways potentially. So, I largely abandoned this project. But I think the point I wanted to make was that if that was successful, it was really not that many lines of code. It was an incredibly easy thing to do just to be able to prove that something, might be able to be fixed. So number 2 is a bit of digital prepping can go a long way. I know prepping gets a bit of a bad rap, but again, if we sort of look at the pragmatic version of this, we can look at individual and community preparedness, which is, I like that euphemism of prepping. So, this can be split into 2 things, such as infrastructure and knowledge and resourcefulness. So we'll talk about Meshtastic as one example, and then self-hosting as the other. Does anybody know what Amazon Sidewalk is? Probably because I ranted at you about it, yep. Yes, cool. So Amazon Sidewalk was announced, around 2019, I think. Essentially, I don't know if this is true in every country, but a lot of people buy Amazon Echo devices and Amazon Alexa devices in their homes. They're like virtual assistants or the doorbells and things that Amazon creates or has acquired, right? And they essentially reprogrammed all of their firmware to create a giant mesh network. And so that map there is showing the amount of coverage they got in that mesh network just with an experiment with their employees. And this really, really chilled my blood a little bit. And so Amazon employees installed their devices around their home as typical customers do, and in just days, those network points combined to support like an actual mesh network right across the Los Angeles basin, which is one of the largest metro regions in the United States. I don't know, this doesn't sit right with me. It's owned, operated, and controlled by a single company, and it was opt-in by default. So there's now this private proprietary mesh internet connection, and it's using customers' devices, and they probably don't even know it. But we can do that too. And so, our version of this now is Meshtastic. I highly recommend that you read about it. It literally does the same thing, but you're choosing and you're opting into it. So it does require you to buy a device up front, but the idea is you can use it to communicate with each other, even just if you go hiking and you all have no phone signal, you can use it for things like that. But you can also use it by hosting the devices in your home, and then everyone else's devices in the neighborhood can find each other. And if you have a decent enough antenna, there's a lot of coverage you can get from it. So with self-hosting, I feel like I don't need to go through this very much, but just in case, it's a computer in your own house with services you host, so that you're not relying on a lot of SaaS products that you have to pay for and rent, and that you need an internet connection to use. You can get started with self-hosting with the Raspberry Pi. I personally use a Purism Libre Mini, but if you've got a Mac Mini kicking around or even an old laptop, you can also do that. Very bright slide warning. If you do want to know what kind of things can I even host, you will get very inspired by this, and it might take you down a rabbit hole, but I'm very not sorry about it. And then if you are upgrading your computer, maybe consider buying one that is actually able to be upgraded and repaired by yourself. I particularly love the Framework company. I think they're doing really good things. I own a Framework, and I love it. You'd be surprised at some of the innovations they've done, such as portable and interchangeable ports even. I think they're really cool. And then the third one, which I think has benefited me the most, is read, learn, and don't limit yourself. Resist complacency and the great cognitive offload. There's so much more out there than just front-end development. And I know that everyone does that as a job, and I know not everyone has the privilege of spare time, but if you have it and you're curious, it's not that scary if you've never looked at it before. Don't be afraid to learn new skills. Becoming dependent on LLMs and other cognitive offloading abstractions, I believe, will be detrimental and disempowering for you. I think Sid actually covered this really well in the talk before me, so it's really just about keeping that balance. So, critical thinking skills. I don't feel like I need to really explain that, but it's really just about avoiding harmful hype cycles. So does anybody know who this is? Rodney Mullen, thank you. So Rodney Mullen is one of the most prolific skateboarders of all time. He's credited with inventing a lot of the tricks that modern day skaters perform. He's an incredibly multifaceted person, and I really like the way that he talks about why he skates, and I think that's something that's inspired me for a while now. He says, "I can't wait to wake up and try something new. I can't sleep at night because I want to try something new." And I just absolutely love that. And there's an intrinsic value in creating something just for the sake of creating it, and I think we can all resonate with that. And better than that, there is this beauty in dropping it into a community of your own making, seeing it dispersed and seeing younger, more talented, just different talent, take it to levels you can never imagine because that lives on. Now, what does that remind you of? Open source, teamwork, stuff that we do, and I hope that we always remember that. But also seeking out other people's ideas, I think, is really important, not just outside of tech, such as skateboarding, but also internally. These are some of my favorite resources that I've gotten a lot out of that helps me think about these sorts of topics. So I highly recommend you check them out if you have the time. Just repeating these two books that radicalized me really quickly. And also just being aware of history. There's a lot of people in this audience that have probably just joined, or they're early in their career and they've just joined this actual discipline. Cliff Stoll was mentioned earlier as well. He's amazing. So there's a lot of people that you can learn from, and a lot of things in these books that are much more historic that are still very relevant to this day. And so I think there's a lot of digital preservation in being able to retain those lessons and to not forget those who came before us. So just to summarize, actions we can take: build tools for your fellow citizens. Digital prepping and self-sufficiency is a good thing, and it's not selfish. It can benefit other people. Stay curious and cultivate critical thinking skills. So I really believe that we're at a crossroads at the moment, and I think as humans we need to double down on what makes us great. I believe that self-sufficiency is a common good that actually enables civic contribution, and I believe that overly heavily abstractions disempower in the name of convenience and profit instead of providing humane interfaces for our fellows. I believe that any tool, including AI, that dilutes our creativity and camaraderie should be treated with passionate suspicion and even rejection. In trying to model ourselves, I feel that we've created a much worse version in the shape of a computer. I am committed to resisting the great cognitive offload in favour of preserving our collective knowledge, empathy, trust, and deep passion as a society, and I hope you'll join me. Thank you.